You wrote an article about youth radicalization, and it had a poll from the Cato Institute.
I found that 34% of 18 to 29-year-olds have a favorable opinion of communism. 62% have a favorable opinion of socialism. And in big cities, 28% of all ages have a favorable view of communism. And these are just some examples of what a massive change there's been in US politics in the past 10 years.
Those would be astonishing if you had told someone like 10 years ago that that's the way that communism is going to be received. What an incredible shift. And this is another thing that's often raised in the comments. Everyone talks about the Overton window. This is like a piece of pop sociology that it's made its way. It's a buzzword now. This is one of the reasons why you have to support Zoran, because he's popularizing socialism. Now, I think an individual like Bernie Sanders, Zoran, by talking about socialism, that's to their credit. By attacking capitalism, very good. Like, we support those things. It does help to have public figures talking about this, but the Overton window is like kind of a linear view of how consciousness changes. Like, there's certain things that are acceptable within public opinion, and there's limits to that, and you can't exceed those limits or go too far into radical territory. Otherwise, your ideas won't be received. Well, based on what you're saying, it's like 30 million potential communists or people who have a favorable view of communism. Is it really such a sort of Red Scare threat that he needs to be worried about, that he's going to out-radical people? The fact that he energized all those young voters, 50,000 activists, that's a small sample, a small taste of what he could really achieve if he were to conjure up a new party of the working class and say, we're here to fight, and we're not going to make deals, and we're not going to try to get along with the billionaires. We're going to fight against capitalism.
If he did that, if he built some kind of workers' organization, a workers' party of some kind, it wouldn't start out with the program that we would vouch for, but that would be a step forward. We would participate in that, put our ideas forward. As you were saying earlier, we're not in favor of so-called purity politics, because it's just not the reality. The working class does not wake up randomly one day and decide a revolution is necessary. That's the conclusion that's reached after years of struggle, years of crisis, testing different options. So that's going to be a process. And of course, forming a party and figuring out what kind of program is necessary is part of it. So we would participate in that. In terms of the potential for that and this question of the Overton window, for the viewer, the Overton window, it's basically the idea of like the acceptable parameters of mainstream political discussion. And so you see people saying, well, Zoran's at least shifting the Overton window. You used to hear the same thing about Bernie Sanders. And I think it is true in a sense that individuals like Sanders or Mamdani can kind of catalyze this process. Like, obviously, when you have a major public figure talking about socialism, talking about single-payer healthcare in the case of Sanders, or free buses or rent freeze in the case of Zoran, it does kind of bring it to the forefront of political discussion. But is it the case that until that person came along, everyone was just a blank slate politically, and then once the correct idea has come along, there emerges an interest in socialism? I think above all, it's the economic crisis, it's the crisis of capitalism that makes people open to those ideas. And then it's true, individuals can come along and become like a focal point. Like if you look at Sanders, years leading up to 2016, he was an obscure figure. He was a senator in Vermont, but most people didn't know who he was. But it was years, it was coming off of decades of decline, economic decline. There was already an anger in society. The Obama presidency in 2008 had awakened certain hopes, but that quickly did not pan out. And so there was anger. Sanders comes along and is able to kind of give, again, kind of a focal point, kind of capture and catalyze that energy. But if he hadn't done that, I think something like this would have happened eventually nonetheless, because when people are watching their living standards decline, they start to look at different options. They start to lose confidence in the establishment parties and in capitalism. And so I think no matter what exactly happens with Zoran Mamdani, the general interest in socialism is going to maintain. Communism, a class struggle is going to continue to grow because Zoran is part of this broader process of like a revival of interest in socialism.
And a backlash against capitalism.
Yeah.
If the Overton window depends on somebody to kind of move the goalposts, who is it that's played that role for the rising popularity of communism? The 34% of young people under the age of 30 view communism favorably. It's not because there's any big visible political figure who's out there making the case for communism. Yeah. It's an organic rejection of capitalism that's creating that mood. And I think for also the other thing about the Overton window is that there's a polarization happening towards the left and towards the right, if you like. I mean, even these words about left and right, now people are saying it's more like the up versus down. And I think that is really, it's a class sentiment that's coming to the fore, and it's looking for someone to tap into it and give it an expression. That's really the thing. And it's not It's not that people are too afraid of radical politics. People want to tear down the system.
Yeah.
And they're looking for like some alternative and someone to give a proposal for how that can be done.
And I think a lot of these people, like, they voted for Zoran despite the fact that he's a Democrat. That wasn't like an essential feature of him winning. He happens to be a Democrat, but it was above all his program. And again, there's layers of people that have become socialists or become open to socialism. And so perhaps for many of them, it would have come off as an even more kind of like bold, independent, anti-establishment candidacy if it were genuinely separate from the Democrats.
And really, another thing about the so-called Overton window is basically we're talking about how does mass consciousness change, which is something that as Marxists we're very interested in this question.
Yeah, we explain ideas don't drop from the sky. It's not just random. People form their ideas on the basis of their environment and their experience under capitalism.
Yeah.
And so we're talking about a decades-long process that's of capitalist decline and decay that's created this newfound interest in socialism and class struggle and communism.
Right. And we also know that sometimes decades-long processes can then lead to a tipping point where a leap is taken. One example that comes to mind is, remember in the summer of 2020, after the murder of George Floyd, there was this mass movement, but the specific act of burning down the 3rd police precinct in Minneapolis, the week after that, there was polls that said that 54% of the population saw that as a justified act. That's pretty astonishing. It was like something like 3/4 of the population felt that the anger behind the protest was justified. So mass public opinion was behind this protest and even this de facto act of insurrection, like torching a police station. You would not think that that's within the Overton window, right? And probably the day before it happened, it wasn't. Like, people weren't in favor of that. Then it happened. But in that specific context of this mass movement, people are thinking about it as part of this unfolding event, like a mass protest against police terror. And they saw George Floyd, and like, that's the way consciousness is impacted. It's by events. And it can happen very explosively. Like that was a big leap forward for consciousness in the summer of 2020. Suddenly people are talking about not just community control of the police, defund the police, but like abolishing the police, like millions of people in the streets, basically taking the steps towards what could have become a pre-revolutionary situation if there had been a leadership for it. But that's the point that we're getting at, is that the so-called Overton window thinks of consciousness as being like a pretty slow-moving thing. And revolutionary politics is based on this understanding that consciousness might be conservative for a long period of time, but it can also take a leap forward. And the class struggle is about helping that consciousness to advance to the point where the working class realizes that the only way to fight for its interests, the only way to achieve the demands that it has, is to end the capitalists' control over the society, to break their control and to take that over and to plan it democratically. Now, if you want to arrive at that destination, that's for us the question of strategy. Like, how do you move forward towards that? For us, any little partial step would be great, but that would mean workers have to see themselves as an independent force, like an independent segment of society separate from the capitalists, and understand that the capitalists are the enemy, and the capitalists control the media, and the capitalists control the state, and they control the courts. Those aren't neutral institutions. Those are the instruments of the enemy. So how do we organize against them? This is it's like a question of your whole mentality.